Once symbols of Japan's imperial might, the warships that had ruled the Pacific now sat abandoned and rusting. These vessels, once designed for conquest, were now trapped in a world that no longer had a place for them. The end of the war had shattered the empire, and these once proud ships became remnants of a lost past, their future uncertain. Could they be repurposed, or were they doomed to fade into history? Their fate was shaped not by military necessity, but by the harsh realities of post-war rebuilding and the desire to erase the symbols of a war that had ravaged the world. The Japanese warships that once ruled the Pacific, towering symbols of military might, sat idle and vulnerable in the aftermath of World War II. Their hulls, once sleek with purpose, now rusted in the wake of a global conflict that had shattered nations, economies, and ideals. What had once been the pride of an empire, a fleet designed for conquest, was suddenly surplus, a casualty of peace. For these ships, the end of hostilities marked not the end of their story, but the beginning of a new chapter fraught with uncertainty. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the Pacific was left with an immense surplus of war material, some of which would never see action again. The warships, monuments to technological advancement, pride, and terror, had no place in the post-war order. Japan's military capabilities were dismantled by the Allied occupation forces, and its navy was all but destroyed. What remained of Japan's once mighty fleet was left stranded in a world that no longer had room for such symbols of war. In the months following the formal surrender, the Allied powers, under the guidance of General Douglas MacArthur, began an extensive process of disarmament and demilitarization across Japan. The Imperial Navy's formidable fleet, which had once boasted nearly 1,000 ships at its peak, now faced destruction, disposal, and degradation. For the ships that survived the Pacific conflict, their fate was sealed not by the battles they fought, but by the politics of peace. The question was no longer one of strategy or defense but of practicality and economics. The assets were now surplus, obsolete and expensive to maintain, yet still potent symbols of war that had no place in the new order. A fundamental question lingered: what to do with the enormous fleet left behind? Japan's maritime power, which once stretched across the vast Pacific, now had no strategic purpose. The ships were too expensive to maintain, requiring costly upkeep and manpower, resources that Japan, devastated by war, could scarcely afford. Many of the ships had been damaged during the war, and the ones that survived the conflict were, in many cases, no longer technologically advanced or efficient compared to newer ships being developed worldwide. The Japanese government, under the guidance of the Allied occupation, faced intense pressure to dismantle this remnants of military might. The global landscape had shifted. The primary concern was the rebuilding of Japan, not the preservation of its war machines. Resources that could have been used for the restoration of the civilian economy were instead allocated to the removal of military assets. The task was massive: decommissioning, scrapping, and the repurposing of these former symbols of Japan's power. It was clear that the ships were no longer fit for their original purpose. But what could be done with them? Some ships were selected for immediate scrapping. The most obsolete and heavily damaged warships, which could not be refitted or repurposed, were quickly broken down. These vessels, once proud symbols of Japan's naval dominance, were melted down for scrap metal, to be repurposed in the rebuilding of Japan's civilian infrastructure. These ships were now valued only for their raw materials, a stark contrast to their original purpose as instruments of military power. The process was time-consuming and labor-intensive, but essential. It was, in essence, the material residue of an empire's defeat, now reduced to its simplest form, metal to be reused. For some of the larger, more intact ships, the decision was more complex. The fate of Japan's capital ships, vessels like the battleships Yamato and Musashi, once the most formidable in the world, was caught between history and practicality. These ships, which had survived the war or had been partially repaired, held a certain mythic value. Scrapping them would erase a part of Japan's military legacy. Yet, to leave them as monuments to the past seemed equally unwise, particularly in a time of economic hardship. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, had been sunk in 1945 during the Battle of Okinawa. Its sister ship, the Musashi, had met a similar fate in 1944. Their wrecks lay at the bottom of the Pacific, their massive structures entombed in a watery grave. However, there were still several large ships, including aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers, which had survived the war and were now caught in a limbo of sorts. They were symbols of the might Japan had once wielded, but they no longer had the means to project that power. For the ships that could not be scrapped immediately, the question turned to repurposing. Some of these ships, despite their military histories, were considered potential assets in the post-war civilian world. The Japanese government, under the guidance of the Allies, began exploring possibilities for converting military vessels into merchant ships, transport vessels, or even oil tankers. It was a desperate measure to make use of what remained, a way of salvaging value from what had been the instruments of destruction. But these efforts, too, were hindered by the pressing realities of the post-war world. The cost of such conversions was high, and Japan's economy, in the immediate years following the war, was struggling to regain its footing. The infrastructure necessary to repair and retrofit these massive ships was severely limited, and the expertise needed to refashion warships into civilian vessels was in short supply. Despite the best efforts of planners, the numbers of ships successfully repurposed were relatively small. Beyond the logistical challenges of scrapping or repurposing, there was also a growing recognition of the emotional weight these ships carried. For many, these vessels were symbols of Japan's wartime ambitions, symbols of destruction, loss, and suffering. Their continued existence, even in a repurposed state, was seen by some as a reminder of a dark past. The decision to scrap or repurpose them was not merely a practical one, it was a moral and political decision as well. How much of Japan's past was the nation willing to carry into the future? Throughout this period, the United States, as the occupying force, held significant sway over these decisions. With its own priorities focused on demilitarizing Japan and integrating it into the post-war order, the U.S. placed considerable pressure on the Japanese government to ensure that the warships were either scrapped or repurposed in ways that aligned with the New World Order. The Cold War was beginning to take shape, and the Japanese military would not play a role in it. The remaining warships, however large and powerful, would have to be consigned to history. The final fates of many of Japan's warships were as varied as their original purposes. Some were scrapped, some converted, and some simply abandoned. The process unfolded slowly, a grim and methodical disassembling of what had once been the heart of Japan's military force. These ships, which had once filled the seas with their might, were now largely forgotten, their stories reduced to little more than footnotes in the larger narrative of Japan's post-war reconstruction. But the story of the Japanese warships did not end there. Their wrecks and ruins still lie in the waters of the Pacific, serving as silent witnesses to a war that reshaped the world. And for some, the memory of these ships, of what they represented, remains a haunting reminder of a time when the world seemed on the brink of total destruction. The transformation of the Japanese warships after World War II was not a sudden event. It unfolded over years, a long and deliberate process shaped by economic necessity, geopolitical realities, and the desire to cleanse the past. The slow fate of these ships reflected the equally slow recovery of Japan itself, a nation determined to rebuild and redefine itself in the face of total defeat. In the years following the war, Japan was left to grapple with the immense psychological burden of its militaristic legacy while simultaneously attempting to transition to a peaceful, civilian economy. In the years immediately after the war, the Allied occupation forces, particularly under the direction of General Douglas MacArthur, had an overwhelming role in dictating the country's course. The dismantling of Japan's military apparatus was seen as crucial to ensuring that the empire could never again threaten the Pacific region. A major part of this demilitarization was the removal of its warships, which had once embodied its naval superiority. But the fate of these ships went beyond mere destruction. It was a complex intersection of practicality, economics, and national identity. The ships that remained after the war were mostly mothballed in various harbors across Japan. Some had been severely damaged during the war but were still technically salvageable. Others were relatively intact but outdated. Despite their condition, these vessels were too large and too expensive to simply discard. Many of these ships had been designed to fulfill specific military roles that no longer existed in the post-war world. Japan's military was disbanded, and the country was now subject to strict limitations on its military capacity. It was a time when the Japanese government, newly directed by the Allies, faced profound financial constraints. The country's infrastructure had been destroyed, its economy was in tatters, and the idea of maintaining a naval force was an unrealistic dream. The Japanese government, with little choice but to comply with the Allies' directives, embarked on the task of scrapping or repurposing its warships. However, this was no straightforward process. The very scale of the ships, combined with the technical challenges of their dismantling, created immense logistical hurdles. Warships were not designed for easy disassembly. They were built with heavy armor, thick steel hulls, and complex machinery that required specialized knowledge to dismantle safely. The first step in dealing with these hulking giants was often to dry dock them in places like Yokosuka, Kure, and Sasebo, where they could be stripped of their weaponry, electronics, and other sensitive equipment. In some cases, these ships were sunk in deep waters to prevent them from falling into the hands of the enemy or from being seen as reminders of Japan's military past. The economic realities were equally daunting. Japan was unable to sustain the naval infrastructure necessary to maintain these ships, and most of them had been built during the 1930s and 1940s, an era that saw a dramatic rise in naval technology. As the war ended, ships that had once been cutting-edge were suddenly outdated. The cost of upgrading and maintaining them would have far exceeded their utility. The Japanese government faced the harsh choice of either continuing to pour money into keeping an obsolete fleet afloat or scrapping them entirely, a decision that seemed inevitable given the country's financial devastation. But scrapping these ships was more than just an economic choice. It was also a painful political and emotional one. For many in Japan, the warships represented a source of pride, a symbol of national strength that had been lost in the tides of history. To dismantle them was to erase part of Japan's martial heritage, a painful reminder of the cost of militarism and expansion. In some quarters, there was even resistance to the idea of scrapping the ships, as they were seen as tangible reminders of Japan's imperial past. But this resistance was largely quiet, overshadowed by the larger forces at play. Some of the larger ships, like aircraft carriers and battleships, which had been flagship vessels during Japan's imperial days, were simply too large and too symbolic to be disposed of easily. Some of these ships, such as the Yamato and the Musashi, had already been lost during the war, but others, like the Shokaku and Zuikaku, carriers that had played critical roles in battles like Midway, still lingered on in varying states of disrepair. The very scale of these ships created logistical challenges in how to handle them. Some were sold off for their scrap value, but others were repurposed for various non-military uses. In a few notable cases, the Japanese government attempted to convert some of the remaining warships into merchant ships or oil tankers. The rationale behind this was simple. These ships represented a form of capital that could be put to work in Japan's struggling post-war economy. Converting these massive ships into commercial vessels seemed like a pragmatic solution to an otherwise insurmountable problem. However, these conversions were not without their difficulties. The ships were not designed for civilian use, and modifying them to accommodate new functions required extensive changes to their hulls, propulsion systems, and cargo holds. The cost of such conversions was prohibitively high, and even if successful, the ships would have struggled to compete with more modern vessels built specifically for commercial use. The task of conversion was ultimately more symbolic than practical. It was an attempt to make use of what remained from a bygone era, to bring some value out of the wreckage of war. Yet, the number of ships that were successfully repurposed was small. Most were scrapped for their valuable materials, with some parts, such as engines, guns, and radar systems, being stripped and sold off for use in other industries. These items, once the pinnacle of military technology, now served entirely different purposes. The grand warships, stripped of their power and purpose, became nothing more than raw material to help rebuild a shattered nation. In the midst of this dismantling, the psychological impact of the warship's destruction was felt deeply across Japan. The warships had been more than just tools of war. They had been symbols of Japan's military might, their strength, and their expansionist ambitions. The idea of erasing them from existence was a quiet acknowledgement of the cost of the war. It was an attempt to disassociate from the violence that had been carried out under their banners. Yet, despite the physical destruction of these ships, their legacy persisted in the collective memory of the Japanese people. The ships remained as ghosts in the waters of history, reminders of a time that the country was reluctant to fully confront. One of the more tragic aspects of the post-war period was the abandonment of certain ships. As Japan's military was dismantled and repurposed for civilian purposes, some of the warships were simply left to deteriorate. These ships, many of which had once been feared and revered, were left in port, their once gleaming decks now rusting away. The notion of military dominance seemed increasingly irrelevant in a world now shaped by new powers and new ideologies. Japan, focused on recovery, found little need for symbols of its militaristic past. The warships, once the pride of a nation, were left to be consumed by the elements, their steel shells slowly succumbing to corrosion and neglect. Over time, some ships were given new lives in other forms. For example, in the years following the war, Japan began to slowly shift its focus from naval power to economic growth. Many of the warships that survived the scrapping process found themselves relegated to more mundane tasks, often serving as storage facilities or even being used as training platforms for various maritime activities. While these ships were far from their former glory, they still carried the weight of Japan's wartime experience.